In this edition of Real Estate Exam Prep, we're going to discuss the gross rent multiplier, or the GRM. The gross rent multiplier, or GRM, is a form of the income approach to appraisal. So if you recall from your studies of appraisals and ultimately determining the value of a property using appraisal methods, one of those is the income approach. And remember, an appraiser is going to use the income approach to appraisal when they're trying to determine the value of income-producing properties. So in other words, rather than maybe your principal residence and trying to figure out what that's worth, the income approach, remember, is likely going to be best used for properties that are primarily used for the production of income. So the GRM is one of these methods, which is commonly used for small residential income properties. So a small residential income property usually can be defined as something that's 1 to 4 units. So the GRM helps us understand value. It helps an appraiser determine value for smaller residential income producing properties. So what the GRM ultimately does is gives us a single factor of comparison that's based on the sales price of the comparable properties and the rent that they generate. So in other words, in order to compare a bunch of different properties in the marketplace, comps, what the appraiser is going to do is use the GRM, because rather than looking at just what the property sold for, they're going to look at the relationship between what the comparable property sold for and how much rent money they generate. Other facts about the GRM: keep in mind what gross rent really means. So understand that this method, the gross rent multiplier, is based on the total gross rent for the comparable income properties. So remember, gross rent and gross rent multiplier means it is a flat amount. So we do not consider with the GRM expenses of the property. We do not consider with the GRM vacancy or collection losses. So in other words, remember, as a financial term, gross means a flat amount. So the GRM is looking at the monthly rent that a property brings in. So since this is part of the income approach to appraisal, what an appraiser is going to be doing is looking at other income producing properties, small residential properties, remember, under 4 units or 1 to 4 residential units. And what we're going to be doing is comparing what those sold for and how much monthly rent they're bringing in. So that's the whole point of the GRM, is to take multiple comparable income properties and to ultimately compare what they sold for, their monthly gross rent, to help us compare one to the other. And so just as with most analysis of comps, the more income producing properties compared under the gross rent multiplier, the better the results will be. All right, so here's how we compute the GRM. The formula is simple. It is the sales price of the rental property divided by its monthly rent, and that gives you the GRM. So in other words, if we were looking in a marketplace as an appraiser, and we've got several different rental properties, they are all sold for different numbers, and they're bringing in different amounts of rent, what the GRM allows me to do is to compare a bunch of rental properties to one another by boiling them down to one single number of comparison, or the GRM. Think about when somebody's looking at a house on the marketplace, what ultimately do they usually use to compare one to the other? Maybe the price per square foot. Well, that doesn't really matter as much with income producing properties, because it's really about the cost to acquire the property and the rent that it's going to bring in. So if we've got these 3 rental houses in the marketplace, it's going to be difficult, or if we look at 5 or 7 or 10, to really compare them without being able to boil them down to an easy method of comparison. That's the whole point of the GRM. So let's take a look at property number 1 to show you how it works. Property number 1 was sold for $150,000. The monthly rent that it brings in is $1,250. So remember, To compute the GRM, we're simply going to divide the sales price by its gross monthly rent, and that gives you $120. So the GRM of property number 1 is $120. Let's look at property number 2. Its sales price was $165,000. Its monthly rent is $1,350. Well, by dividing the sales price by the monthly rent, the GRM of property number 2 is $122. So you can already see we're taking all of these numbers, these rents, these sales prices, and we're being able to break them down into an easy method of comparison. Let's look at property number 3. It sold for $155,000. Its monthly rent is $1,240. So if you divide the sales price by the monthly rent, you get a GRM of $125. So remember, when an appraiser ultimately is looking at the GRM and we're considering each of these 3 properties, this one has a GRM of 120, this one of 122, this one of 125, at least what we can see here is that properties in this area of this type generally would bring a GRM of 120 to 125. So we can look at it as a range of appropriateness. And then where the expertise of the appraiser comes in is to weigh certain GRMs over the others. In other words, consider which one probably should be applied to the subject. Because what we're doing here is looking at 3 properties that already sold, and we're going to decide or use those to compare to our subject to help us understand what our subject is likely worth in consideration of the other properties in the marketplace. All right, so now that the appraiser has had an opportunity to look at the comps in the marketplace and to calculate a GRM for each, now we can use that GRM to help determine the value of our subject property. Remember, the subject property is the one that the appraiser is hired to determine the value for. So remember that the GRMs are calculated for a number of comps. The range of GRMs is then analyzed and weighted. So it's important to understand that, remember, from the previous slide, we had examples of 3 GRMs. You're not just going to average those together. The appraiser is going to use their expertise to weight the appropriate GRMs and help determine the properties that are most similar to the subject, and then a GRM is going to be selected to apply to the subject property and estimate its value. So to use the GRM determined for the subject is then going to be put into this symbol formula, the gross rent times the GRM. So the gross rent for this particular property, so in other words, maybe it's the one that's on the market for sale, is renting for $1,200 a month. Using the information we just discussed, the appraiser has determined that a 125 GRM is appropriate after analyzing the comps and the other GRMs in the area. So the appraiser is using their expertise to say a 125 GRM is appropriate here. So if the subject rents for $1,200 and a 125 GRM is appropriate, the formula is simple. Take the gross rent, multiply it by the GRM, and you'll get the estimated value of the subject property. So this gross rent for the subject multiplied by the GRM derived from that first step gives an estimate of value. Remember, all an appraised value is determined to do is to give you an opinion of value. So this is the appraiser giving you an opinion of value using research and a determined method, which in this case is the GRM. So if you wanted to take that information and use it, consider, okay, so we think this property is worth $150,000. So what can I buy it for? Or what is the seller asking? Because for me, using this analysis, if I was the investor, that means that essentially I don't want to pay any more than $150,000. Otherwise, I won't be getting the reasonable returns that the rest of the marketplace is showing relative to the rent income that's being generated by properties in this area. All right, that concludes our exam prep video on GRM. So hopefully that helps you. So we thank you for watching and good luck on your real estate exam. If you want more, please make sure to visit us on Facebook at Facebook/Donaldson Education. Also, if you want more videos, we have plenty on our YouTube page, and you can find us at youtube.com/C/Donaldson Education.